Okay, so in Virginia, the context for renewable energy was set by the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which was passed in 2020, I believe. The purpose of the Clean Economy Act was to gradually, by 2035 to 2040, get Virginia off of fossil energy generation for electricity. It set targets for offshore wind, for and utility scale solar, and for community rooftop solar. So that was the statutory driver in Virginia. However, what's happening in the real world is that the demand for renewable energy is being driven by the growth of data centers, primarily in Northern Virginia. The data center companies tend to be West Coast, environmentally oriented, Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, and they want to power their data centers with renewable energy. So instead of the statutory target of around 16,000 megawatts of solar, we may be looking at 51,000 megawatts of solar in the Commonwealth. So that's causing the demand for energy to grow at around 5% a year, whereas our population is probably only growing at something like 1% a year. It may actually be flat. Economics is a key driver in renewable energy, and that's true of solar as well. It's simply a lot cheaper to take a couple hundred acres of farmland and put solar panels on it than it is to take a couple hundred houses and put solar panels on the roofs of those houses. It's a question of economies of scale. My house now has solar panels on it. I've got 20 panels on my house, which is a far cry from 1,000 or 10,000 panels in what used to be a farmer's field somewhere. In Virginia, at least, we're averaging between 10 and 12 acres of land per megawatt. Those are based on DEQ and Virginia DOE estimates. So I'd encourage you, as you're doing your research for this special topic, to go to the DEQ website and go to the Virginia Department of Energy website and look around for information. Now, that 12 acres on the high end, that includes all the land inside the perimeter of the solar farm. The disturbed acreage is more like 7 acres. So it's only got 7 acres that may be actually underneath panels in that 12 acre per megawatt facility. We've lost about 40,000 acres of farms and forests in Virginia so far to utility scale solar, and that's growing at around 5,000 acres a year. So, what does the future look like? DEQ estimates say we may be looking at between 300,000 and 650,000 acres of solar in the next 20 years or so. By comparison, that's 2 or 3 times the size of the Shenandoah National Park. That's a lot bigger than Prince William County. So we're talking about potentially a large chunk of land. Okay, next slide. So basically, there was no solar to speak of in Virginia in 2016. You can see in 2020, with the passage of the Clean Economy Act, things start to take off. So that's all I really wanted to say about that slide. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so the rest of my presentation relates to the various key topics. So one of the first things in key topic number 1 is to identify the key agencies at various levels. At the federal level, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is a key player in energy. It deals with things like pipelines in particular and interstate transmission lines. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission obviously regulates nuclear. In terms of where the energy resources are, the Department of the Interior at the federal level has most of it. Significant public lands, resources of coal, oil, natural gas. The Outer Continental Shelf has enormous reserves of oil and natural gas. in particular. The Federal Department of Energy does a lot of energy research, although it does very little in the way of energy delivery per se. And legislatures are key players in energy policy at all levels of government. At the federal level, obviously the Congress; at the state level, our own General Assembly. At the state level, there are often, state bureaucracies like DEQ, like the state energy department. But another key player that you have at the state level are the public utility commissions. In Virginia, it's called the State Corporation Commission. Their job is to decide if significant utility energy investments are in the public interest. At the local level, obviously, we've got cities and counties, mayors, city councils, boards of supervisors. Looking at what the energy life cycle, if you will, one can think of extraction. With fossil energy, that's pretty obvious. It comes out of the ground somewhere. Transportation, it has to get from where it's extracted to where it's actually going to be used. And then we typically would talk about generation, transmission, and distribution. Prior to about 20 years ago, you had in utility companies like Dominion that did all three. They owned the power plants where the generation took place. They owned the transmission lines that would move the electrons from the power plants. And then they owned the distribution system in your neighborhood, the wires in your neighborhood. And so in large areas of the country, including Virginia, to some extent, generation has been separated from transmission and distribution. So for instance, Dominion will own some solar farms in the Commonwealth, but it'll buy energy from solar farms that are developed by third parties. And then on the back end, pollution control. This is, I guess, probably most obvious to us all in the context of coal. Scrubbers, fabric filters on those stacks to remove particulates, remove sulfur dioxide. But pollution control is an issue to varying degrees with all forms of energy. In terms of threats to the energy system, economics is always a player. Economics will drive decision making in most societies, particularly Western societies. Geopolitical threats, war, great power competition. One of the drivers theoretically behind the Japanese expansion in World War II is they needed access to oil and coal, and they couldn't get those inside the islands of Japan itself. Hence, they needed to. They felt they needed to expand into Southeast Asia. Great power competition. You could look at the geopolitics of energy in terms of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which more than once in the last 50 years has essentially been able to set global prices for oil. Political threats. Legislatures make decisions. They decide they don't like some types of energy. They decide they do like other types of energy. The sort of decisions they make can have a significant impact. In World War II, the Germans couldn't get access to oil resources, so they figured out a way to liquefy coal and essentially use it as a petroleum substitute. So there could be a wide variety of threats or factors affecting the energy system. Next slide, please. Okay, topic 2. So what are some of the challenges? So if you're an electric utility, life is simple if you just have one big power plant. There's only one place you have to focus on. There's only one place you need to keep running. As a practical matter, most utilities will have traditionally had 5, 10, or 20 large power plants, typically anywhere from, say, 500 megawatts capacity to a network of co-located nuclear plants that may be 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts of capacity. So if you move from a system of having, let's say, 10 1,000 megawatt power plants to having your energy coming from hundreds or thousands potentially of sources, like my rooftop, which maybe gets 100 kilowatts as opposed to 1,000 megawatts, you have real issues with managing that grid. So Dominion may have to buy itself another 2 or 3 supercomputers to deal with the fact that they've got energy coming from 1,000 sources as opposed to 20 sources. So that has got a wide variety of potential complications, because it's much easier to balance the grid if you've got fewer things to look at than if you've got dozens or hundreds of things to look at. Transmission lines. The more places you have generating electricity, the more transmission lines you're going to have. Whether it makes sense scientifically or not, people don't like having transmission lines going over their neighborhood school. They don't like having transmission lines going over their houses. Those big couple 100 feet tall, huge metal towers we're talking about here. So if in a distributed system for energy, you're going to need more transmission lines. And whether you're looking at energy facilities or even citing things like gasoline stations, people are interested in what's happening in their neighborhood. And there's a NIMBY, or not in my backyard, phenomenon, where people would rather have something ugly go somewhere else, or something they perceive as risky go somewhere else, as opposed to their neighborhood. So if you're going to have dozens and dozens of solar farms around the Commonwealth, you can expect to have a little bit more of a NIMBY problem with local communities. It's a lot easier to deal with local politics when you've got one 1,000 megawatt plant than if you've got 100 10 megawatt plants or 100 megawatt plants. It's a lot more boards of supervisors to worry about. That's a lot more mayors to have to deal with. That's a lot more mothers who are concerned about a transmission line, going over the roof of the kid's school. In terms of renewables and energy security, we need to be aware of the fact that the energy comes from somewhere, right? And not just the energy itself, but the critical minerals that go into a lot of our energy infrastructure. The obvious case here are the batteries for electric vehicles. A lot of the critical minerals in those batteries come from places like China or South Africa, which at the very least are very far away, or Russia, or potentially those countries might decide, we just don't want to give the Americans those critical minerals anymore. So the source of critical minerals is clearly a factor. Pipelines, particularly with oil and gas, you've got to move it from where it is to where you want it. And in Virginia, there's a lot of controversy right now about something called the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which would move natural gas, I think it is, from West Virginia and Pennsylvania into Virginia. And the same way people don't like large transmission lines, they tend to be a little bit skeptical about pipelines. So the ability to build pipelines and to site pipelines is an issue. Ocean shipment. If you're moving oil in massive tankers from the Persian Gulf, a bunch of terrorists with Drones in the Red Sea can really screw up international commerce, can prevent those oil tankers from getting to you, or force those oil tankers to go around uh, Cape Horn as opposed to around through the Suez Canal. So there are potential vulnerabilities with shipping it around the ocean. So one of the nice things about renewable energy is that you can, in theory at least, keep your source inside your own perimeter, right? We can generate solar energy in Kansas or in Virginia's Piedmont and not have to import our solar energy from Saudi Arabia. So there are some energy security benefits to renewables. On the other hand, if you're dependent upon critical minerals for that solar energy infrastructure, you're going to have problems. Cybersecurity, I think, in this day and age, is also a risk. I mean, one can interfere. In theory, one could hack the GPS systems of those super tankers bringing oil from one place to another. One could, in theory, hack into Dominion's supercomputer that manages the grid and decide to, turn out the lights on Arlington County. So cybersecurity is an issue that we didn't have 30 years ago, or at least hardly anybody thought about 30 years ago, but it's increasingly a concern now. Okay, next slide, please, Ashley. Okay, renewable energy and natural resources. This is a biggie. It's particularly a hot issue in Virginia, but I will think I'll address this more broadly. So solar energy in particular takes a lot of space. We talked about that earlier. According to the Piedmont Environmental Council, and you might want to check out their website too, if we don't use natural gas and we don't use nuclear to power our data centers when the sun's not shining, or we don't have a huge network of battery systems, then we may end up taking 20% of our farmland and turning it into utility scale solar projects in Virginia. So that begs questions too. Are we going to invest in small modular reactors so we don't have to take 20% of Virginia's farmland? Are we going to say, okay, we are going to take natural gas from the Mountain Valley Pipeline, even we don't like it, because we don't want the trade-off of having to lose so much extra land to utility scale solar. There are also secondary effects of renewable energy. I mentioned the data centers before. So not only are they demanding, most of them, renewable energy, but they also consume a lot of water. So that has implications for cooling purposes on site at the data center. So that has implications in terms of groundwater supply, has implications in terms of surface water availability. Looking at the other categories of renewable energy, I'll skip ahead a little bit. Hydroelectric, it's very clean, and it's very cheap to actually operate. On the other hand, you see this especially in the Pacific Northwest and in California. It's devastated salmon runs. You can't get fish upstream through the dams or downstream past the dams, at least reliably. So in the Snake and Columbia River basins, for instance, in the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, there are like 15 dams between the headwaters of the Snake River, where there used to be large salmon runs 50 years ago, and the mouth of the Columbia. Well, first of all, it's pretty impossible for those salmon to get upstream past those 15 dams into Idaho and spawn. And if they do manage to get there through various human engineered heroics, then you'll lose 5 to 10% of the downstream migrants, the baby salmon, per dam on their way out to the Pacific. So as a result, you've got a whole bunch of endangered species salmon populations in the Pacific Northwest. Even in the eastern part of the country, where our rivers are not as long, there are issues with striped bass migration, herring and shad migration in places like the Susquehanna, for instance. And I think even on some of our Virginia rivers, like the James. So for hydroelectric generation, fish passage is a concern. For wind, migratory bird kills is potentially an issue, depending upon where you put the windmills, and depending upon how they're designed, and depending upon the migratory bird pathway, you could end up killing a whole bunch of birds with windmills. And then people need to eat. Some wiseacre said once, well, you can't eat silicon, you can't eat photovoltaic panels, and that's true. So what happens to the price of food in Virginia if we lose 20% of our farmland? I don't know. But if you think on a global, or at least on a national scale, the states that produce most of our food, especially most of our produce, fruits and vegetables, California and Texas. Southern California is pretty hot. Texas is pretty hot. Climate change is raising the temperature in those areas. And at the same, so that means demand for water is going to be increasing. And guess what? Given a choice between the water going to farms in the Central Valley of California and it going to San Diego and LA, it's going to go to San Diego and LA. If there are farms in Arizona and water is short, that water is going to Phoenix and Tucson. So you're potentially going to be losing agricultural productivity in the hotter areas of the country most affected by climate change. And what does that say in terms of whether or not we ought to be reducing food production in the southeastern part of the country, places like Virginia? Not that we're ever going to be growing pineapples, in Albemarle County, but it's still something to think about. Resident wildlife, potentially are a concern too. You certainly could have deer, grazing around solar panels, I suppose. But the ability to hunt those deer, or the ability to hunt birds is not going to be the same. No one's going to want to have people with shotguns running around their solar farm and shooting up the solar panels while they're looking for deer or looking for woodcock or grouse. So those are some concerns to think about. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so a bit more in the way of statistics. So it's not just an unreasonable concern that we may be losing significant cropland to solar. There's a VCU study from 3 years ago that talks about, in fact, that we are turning high suitability cropland into solar. One of the real environmental challenges with utility scale solar is that the traditional way of doing it is you take in a bulldozer and you do a lot of grading. You do a lot of grading, or you move a bunch of topsoil. You move a bunch of topsoil and with a bunch of clay or some other much more impervious soil underneath that topsoil. That will create, as we'll see in a slide or two, some potential water quality problems. It also means when these solar farms are decommissioned in 20 years or 30 years, it's not like you're going to be able to grow crops on top of what is now a clay soil that used to be a good topsoil before you bulldozed it off. We're also losing a significant amount of trees to utility scale solar, and that has implications in terms of stormwater management and carbon sequestration. There's some statistics here in terms of the state's obligation on the Chesapeake Bay Agreement for planting trees, and basically due in part because of suburbanization, but also because of the growth of utility scale solar that's cutting down trees, the Commonwealth is in the hole by about 4,000 acres of trees compared to where we're supposed to be at this point. A lot of the companies that at least initially came into Virginia and built utility scale solar over the last 2 or 3 years had experience in California or Nevada. Well, Southern California and Nevada are dry and flat. Flat and dry is not Virginia. It rains a lot here. We got a lot of rolling hills. As a result, these out-of-state companies didn't design their solar projects particularly well, and that's creating stormwater issues. Stormwater issues at the same time that our large cities, Richmond, Fairfax, Alexandria, Arlington County, are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on stormwater management. So to the extent poorly designed solar projects are creating stormwater problems in other parts of the Commonwealth, that where those waters feed into the Chesapeake Bay, it's undercutting what we in Fairfax County are doing in terms of our stormwater tax. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here's an example of these stormwater problems and poorly designed solar facilities. In the picture in the upper right, you see a bunch of solar panels basically over dirt. So when it rains, that soil is going to erode. It's going to wash away, and you're going to have a muddy mess like you have on the lower right on that photo of a road that basically was downstream of a poorly designed utility scale solar project. So a couple things on the positive side, a couple things to think about here. While that panel you see on the lower right is fixed, there is a design that you can move the panel up and down. So you can essentially, potentially have that panel vertical, which means you'd eliminate that gutter effect. Now, if you've got nothing but clay or unvegetated soil underneath that panel, you're still going to have an erosion problem, but at least you won't be creating a little gutter effect that you do now, or you would in that instance. There's also a technology that, oh, by the way, you want to Google a company called Nevados, Nevados. DEQ featured it on one of their weekly email blurbs recently. They've got a solar panel where you can change the angle of the panel to deal with that gutter effect. There's also one of the top areas of discussion in the U.S. is how do you make agriculture compatible with utility scale solar? Dominion is experimenting with having sheep graze underneath solar panels. It's a vegetation management tool, as well as a way to at least make some money for the people who own the sheep, because you've got some free forage potentially. But there are some cutting edge technologies not come to Virginia yet, where you could actually turn these panels vertically and have row crops between the panels. So just like we have all sorts of technologies, solutions to pollution in the clean air world and the clean water world, it's possible that by modifying our technology for utility scale solar, we could dramatically cut down on the acreage that we're using and not necessarily take as much land out of agricultural production, because you could potentially grow crops between the rows of solar panels. That hasn't come to Virginia yet, but it's at least a possibility. Okay, next slide. Okay, looking at a global perspective. Okay, so if I'm the government of Uruguay, or I'm the government of Tanzania, or the government of Myanmar, I may not have access or much access to the US capital markets. And raising $10 million or $100 million for an energy investment might not be an easy thing to do. The easiest thing to do if you're living in one of those countries is go chop down a tree and burn it for energy. Probably firewood for, to cook your food, quite frankly. So access to capital to build ththings like nuclear power plants, or to build things like hydroelectric dams, or to build things like 100-foot tall windmills, or Dominion's outer continental shelf wind farm off of Virginia Beach. That's going to cost $10 billion. If they're lucky, it'll only be $10 billion. If you don't have access to the capital markets, you're some third world country, that's not within the realm of possibility. It's a lot easier to take some lignite out of the ground, or to take some coal, or to burn some oil or diesel in a simple generator. Skilled labor. It is not a simple thing to build a nuclear power plant, or a 100-foot windmill, or even a utility scale solar farm. If you don't have the engineering expertise, that's going to be a problem. Resources. If you're a country that has lots of oil and gas, or lots of coal, but you don't have access to critical minerals, and you have to buy, you'd have to buy those from someplace on the other side of the planet. How are you going to do that? How do you tell people that no, you can't burn coal because that's not good thing to do for the planet, when we in Western Europe and North America have had centuries of burning coal? So there's some interesting perception issues there. Geography. If you're in Greenland, or the North Slope of Alaska, or Tierra del Fuego, where in the winter you get 3 or 4 hours of sunlight, solar energy is not much of an option for you. So there are real geographic concerns. Or if you're an area of the world where there's hardly any wind, I'm not sure where that would be, but I'm sure there's someplace, then wind energy is not going to be a realistic option for you. So there are real geographic constraints that governments have to deal with in terms of their options. And then there's the sort of colonialism argument. How do you tell the Indians, and how do you tell the Chinese that they cannot invest in coal-fired power plants when we've been doing it in Western Europe and North America, for a couple of centuries? That sounds like a real colonialistic perspective. One could make the argument that, well, we're all on the same planet, and you need to do your part. But what you're really saying is, we took advantage of the fossil fuels for a couple of centuries, but you can't do it because we think it's bad for you, as well as being bad for us. So interesting geopolitical issues there. Industrial policy. Are we comfortable with China producing half of the solar panels in the planet? Or do we, as the United States, or does West Germany want to say, nope, we're going to build our own industrial base for solar panels, or we're not going to buy windmills from the Danes and the Norwegians. We're going to have our own renewable energy industry. What's the cost of that? Are you willing to bear the cost of that? Are you willing to pay twice as much for your solar panels because you're not willing to import them from China? And how long is it going to take you to build a production capacity to crank out that level of Chinese production of solar panels? Will it take 10 years? Can you wait 10 years? So, there are real questions of industrial policy that are relevant at the global level. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is one of my more fun ones: local action and energy equity. So, has Hunger Games come to Virginia? Are the wealthy Northern Virginia, Fairfax, Loudoun, to some extent, Fauquier and Prince William, where the data centers are, where the highest per capita income in the Commonwealth, are we exploiting south side of Virginia so we can feel good about our data centers only using renewable energy? That's a legitimate question. If I was somewhere in Southside Virginia and someone wanted to take 1,000 acres of the land in my county and turn it into a solar farm, and I knew that energy was going to be going up north to Loudoun or to Fairfax, how would I feel about that? So, what are question of local rights, or frankly, you could say individual rights versus local rights versus a national good. So, this is the United States. Private property is a real thing. Do we have a right to tell farmers, no, you can't sell your farm, you can't do a solar farm, because we don't like the idea of seeing a whole bunch of silicon as we drive by on the road? Or the county governments have the right to say, you'll only take 5% of our land for utility scale solar, or 2% of our land, or you can have solar here, but we don't want anything taking up more than 1,000 acres at a time. And how do those local rights get balanced, or local perception of local rights get balanced against what's quote unquote good for the Commonwealth and what's good for the nation as a whole? Should we agree that we'll just pave over 20% of Virginia so that we can increase the national output of renewable energy by 5%? And does it make a difference if China and India are cranking out CO2 out of new coal power plants? So there are real equity issues here. And then in about 30 states, there's something called the Dillon Rule, and Virginia is one of those states. The Dillon Rule basically is a local government can't do anything unless the state government says it can. So, our counties have no rights unless they were explicitly given to those counties by the General Assembly. Now, a lot of that happened in the 1700s, a lot of that happened in the 1800s, and if you've had a right for a century or two, you think you've got a right. But there's a real debate in Virginia right now in the General Assembly about whether county governments ought to be prevented from saying no to utility scale solar projects. So, these are very real issues in a political system, in a republic or a democracy. What's right is often determined by who's got the votes, and that's a factor too. So, is it fair? Is it right for Fairfax County, which has the largest delegation in the General Assembly, to dictate to some little county that's got maybe 5,000 people in it about whether or not they can prevent utility scale solar projects from being constructed? What is the greater good? How do you balance a greater good against individual rights, against local rights? And do rural Virginia counties have a reasonable expectation to be rural, or should they just get over it and be willing to accept thousands of acres of utility scale solar? So I'm not sure. What I want to do is get you thinking about these questions. I'm not sure what the answer is, if there is in fact an answer at all. But these are the public policy questions that we're grappling with. Often it boils down to who pays and who benefits. Next slide, please. So here is a map. It's about a year old of where solar was being developed in Virginia. You will see there is none in Fairfax. I don't think there's any in Loudoun. It's mostly in South Central Virginia and Southeastern Virginia. Those are, interestingly enough, the counties with small populations and by percentage at least the highest minority populations in the county, in the Commonwealth. So the solar facilities right now, at least, are being concentrated in relatively small counties with large minority populations. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I don't know. I suppose if you're a poor African-American farmer and someone's willing to give you a couple of $1 million for your land to build a utility scale solar project, that's a good thing. On the other hand, if the person who owns that land actually lives in Charlottesville or lives in Pennsylvania and the land is being rented for agriculture, then the local people aren't benefiting from that check that goes to the landowner. I think that's our last slide, Ashley.